The rain did not care that she was legally the Duchess of Westshire. It fell in heavy, freezing sheets across the sprawling grounds of the Pendleton estate, soaking through the thin, pastel blue silk of Eleanor's dress. The fabric, once an elegant, understated piece meant to keep her invisible at high society gatherings, now clung to her skin like ice. Her damp chestnut hair whipped across her pale ivory face, but she did not raise her hands to shield her eyes. She just stood there on the wet gravel, staring at the single leather suitcase that had been tossed carelessly out the front doors. Behind her, the massive wrought iron gates of the estate stood tall and unforgiving. Ahead of her, framed by the towering marble portico and the warm, golden glow of chandelier light spilling through the floor to ceiling windows, was her husband, Arthur Pendleton. He stood just inside the threshold, out of the rain. His custom three-piece charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his broad shoulders relaxed, his posture rigid with the arrogant ease of a man who owned everything he could see. His cold gray eyes looked past the rain, past the discarded suitcase, and settled on Eleanor with the blank, dismissive stare one might reserve for a broken piece of furniture being hauled out to the trash. He held a crystal glass of red wine. He did not take a step forward. Wrapped around his left arm was Lady Beatrice. She wore a backless crimson gown that demanded the attention of every billionaire and aristocrat currently drinking champagne in the grand ballroom behind them. But what caught the faint light of the portico was the necklace resting against her flawless porcelain collarbone, a heavy triple-strand pearl necklace. The Pendleton family heirlooms, the pearls that legally belonged to Eleanor. Beatrice leaned her head against Arthur's shoulder, a polished, cruel smile curving her lips. She raised her voice just enough to cut through the sound of the downpour. "I told the staff to be careful with her bag, Arthur," Beatrice said, her blue eyes gleaming with predatory satisfaction, but it seems she didn't have much worth packing anyway. "It's for the best. She always looked so completely out of place here." Eleanor heard the words. She felt the freezing rain sliding down her cheeks, washing away the faint natural tracks of her mascara. Her slender body shivered, an involuntary reaction to the biting cold, but her spine remained painfully straight.
She did not cry.
She had promised herself 3 years ago, when the emotional neglect first began, that she would never give Arthur Pendleton the luxury of her tears. Instead, her freezing, red-tinged fingers curled tighter around the only object she had deliberately taken from the house, a vintage silver key. It was the key to the West Wing Annex, the cold, drafty corner of the estate where Arthur had effectively exiled her after their arranged marriage had served the financial purpose for his family. Earth. It was a heavy, useless thing, but the metal digging into her palm was the only anchor keeping her grounded in reality. "Leave the key, Eleanor," Arthur said. His voice was a deep, flat baritone that carried over the storm.
No anger.
No sorrow. Just absolute authority. Eleanor looked up at the man who had forgotten her heart for years. He had treated her like a ghost, paraded his mistresses through the grand halls, and slowly erased her from the social standing of the city. Tonight, on the evening of their anniversary gala, he had allowed Beatrice to instruct the servants to throw her belongings into the rain. "She doesn't even need it," Beatrice whispered to him, trailing a manicured fingernail down his lapel. "We are remodeling the annex anyway. It smells like old dust and wasted time." Arthur took a slow sip of his wine. He didn't look at his wife's trembling shoulders. He didn't look at her pale face. "I never wanted her," Arthur said. The words were spoken to Beatrice, but they were loud enough, sharp enough, to reach the gravel driveway. "Let her leave. The press won't care. No one ever noticed her anyway." The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Inside the gala, The muffled sound of a string quartet continued to play. Outside, Eleanor stood in the freezing dark. Arthur turned away. He was actually turning his back on her, ready to walk back into the warmth of his empire, ready to leave the woman he broke alone in the rain with nothing but a leather suitcase. Then, the sound of a luxury engine cut through the night. It was a low, expensive purr that rolled up the circular driveway, stopping exactly between Eleanor and the marble steps. The sleek Blacktown car idled. The headlights cut through the torrential rain, throwing long, dramatic shadows across the wet stone. Arthur paused. He turned back around, his sharp, aquiline nose tilting upward, a frown finally breaking his composed features. Beatrice's cruel smile faltered. A heavy car door opened. A large black umbrella bloomed into the night. A man stepped out. He moved with a quiet, dangerous grace. He wore a midnight blue velvet tuxedo, entirely unbothered by the storm. His sharp jawline and dark, observant eyes were half hidden by the shadow of the umbrella. But as he stepped into the glow of the estate lights, a ripple of pure, unadulterated shock crossed Arthur's face. Julian Croft, the self-made billionaire, the tech and investment titan who had been systematically outmaneuvering Arthur's old money empire for the past year. He was supposed to be in London. He was certainly not invited to the Pendleton anniversary gala. Julian did not look at Arthur. He did not look at Beatrice. He walked straight to Eleanor. Eleanor froze as the massive black umbrella shielded her from the punishing rain. The sudden absence of the freezing downpour was jarring. She looked up, her wide, set hazel eyes meeting Julian's dark gaze. He didn't offer a pitying smile. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply shifted the umbrella to one hand, shrugging off his heavy, bespoke wool overcoat with the other. With deliberate, respectful gentleness, Julian draped the warm coat over Eleanor's rain-soaked shoulders. The thick fabric engulfed her fragile frame, radiating a heat that made her breath catch in her throat. Up on the marble portico, the crystal wine glass in Arthur's hand tilted. A few drops of dark red wine spilled over the rim, staining his fingers. Earth. His aristocratic jaw clenched so hard, the bone looked ready to snap, frothed. Arthur's voice cracked like a whip across the driveway, the cold indifference entirely gone, replaced by a sudden, violent possessiveness. What the hell do you think you're doing? Julian finally turned his head. His expression was dangerously calm. He looked at Arthur, then at the suitcase in the mud, and finally at Beatrice wearing the pearls. A rather harsh night to be admiring the architecture. Pendleton, Julian said, his voice smooth and laced with sharp irony. He looked back down at Eleanor. She pulled the lapels of his coat closer to her chest. Her right hand was still securely wrapped around the silver key. Julian asked her, his voice dropping to a quiet register meant only for her. Eleanor took one last breath of the freezing air. She did not look at Arthur. She did not look at the mansion. She nodded once. Julian Croft did not raise his voice. He did not step forward to challenge Arthur Pendleton on the marble steps. In the high-stakes world of corporate warfare and elite aristocracy, raising one's voice was a sign of lost composure, and Julian Croft never lost his composure. Instead, he offered Arthur nothing but the devastating weight of his silence. A uniformed driver stepped out from the shadows of the town car, silently lifting Eleanor's ruined leather suitcase from the mud and placing it into the trunk. Julian stepped back, holding the black umbrella steady against the driving rain, and opened the rear door of the car for Eleanor. Up on the portico, the reality of the moment finally fractured Arthur's aristocratic mask. The man who had spent 3 years treating his wife as an invisible inconvenience suddenly found himself unable to accept her departure. Not like this. Not with his greatest corporate rival serving as her shield. Croft! Arthur's voice boomed over the storm, tight with a sudden, violent possessiveness. He took a step forward, his expensive leather shoes crossing the threshold into the rain. I am speaking to you. She is my wife. You will step away from her. Julian paused. He turned his head slowly, the rain drumming a relentless beat against his umbrella. He looked at Arthur, standing there with the spilled red wine on his fingers and the panicked mistress clutching his arm. Julian's dark eyes were completely devoid of respect. You threw her out, Pendleton. Julian said smoothly, his voice carrying the calm, sharp edge of a blade. I am simply taking out the trash that you were too blind to value. Have a pleasant evening. He didn't wait for a response. Julian turned his attention back to Eleanor, extending a hand to guide her. He did not grab her. He merely offered the support, leaving the choice entirely to her. Eleanor placed her freezing hand in his. She stepped into the warm, leather-scented interior of the town car, the heavy bespoke coat still wrapped tightly around her shivering shoulders. Julian closed the door with a solid, expensive thud, effectively cutting off the sound of the storm and Arthur's echoing demands. A moment later, the car pulled smoothly down the long, winding driveway, leaving the wrought iron gates of the Pendleton estate behind. Inside the cabin, the silence was absolute. The privacy partition separating them from the driver was already raised. The soft ambient lighting illuminated the raindrops sliding down the tinted glass. Julian sat across from her. He pulled a clean, dry microfiber towel from a compartment and laid it gently on the seat beside her, completely respecting her physical space. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't ask what had happened. He treated her not as a broken victim, but as a dignitary who had merely encountered bad weather. My penthouse at the Vanguard Tower is secure, Julian said quietly. No press, no staff. You can rest there. Thank you, Eleanor managed to say. Her voice was raspy, trembling slightly from the cold, but it did not break. She looked down at her lap. Beneath the thick, warm wool of Julian's coat, her pastel blue silk dress was ruined, plastered to her skin like a second layer of frost. Her fingers, red and numb, were still curled fiercely around the vintage silver key. She stared at the piece of metal. It was cold, jagged, and heavily tarnished. To Arthur, it was a piece of junk belonging to a forgotten annex. To Beatrice, it was a symbol of Eleanor's uselessness. But as Eleanor traced the rigid edges of the key, her shivering began to subside. The tears that had threatened to fall back on the gravel driveway evaporated. The crushing weight of the public humiliation, the sting of Beatrice's pearls, the flat cruelty of Arthur's voice, it all began to harden into something entirely different. The pain was receding, replaced by a cold, expensive stillness that settled deep into her bones. They thought she was leaving with nothing. They thought they had stripped her of her dignity and her place in the world. They didn't know that the silver key was not just a memory. It was the physical anchor to a private, encrypted safety deposit box. A box that held the digital ledgers, shell company filings, and debt acquisitions she had been meticulously orchestrating for the past 3 years, while Arthur had been parading Beatrice around the city and ignoring his quiet, fading wife. Eleanor had been buying up the deeply leveraged debt of the Pendleton Group. She closed her eyes, her breathing finally evening out. The woman they broke had been left on the gravel. The woman riding in the town car was the silent architect of their impending ruin. Miles away, the storm continued to batter the Pendleton estate. Arthur stood on the marble portico long after the red taillights of Julian Croft's car had vanished into the darkness. The freezing rain had soaked the shoulders of his charcoal suit, but he didn't seem to notice. His chest rose and fell in rigid, uneven breaths. Darling, Beatrice murmured, shivering as she tugged at his sleeve. Come inside. You're getting wet. The guests are waiting for the anniversary toast. Arthur looked down at his hand. The crystal wine glass was empty, the red stains on his fingers looking disturbingly like blood. He had wanted Eleanor gone. He had found her presence irritating, a constant reminder of a business arrangement he no longer needed. He had wanted the freedom to install Beatrice as the undisputed lady of the house, but seeing Eleanor wrapped in Julian Croft's coat, seeing another man, his most dangerous rival, treat her with a reverence Arthur had never bothered to offer, had ignited a toxic, unfamiliar fire in his gut. It wasn't love. It was the sudden, violent realization of a loss of control. He had dictated the narrative of his marriage for 3 years, and in a single moment, Croft had rewritten the ending. Arthur threw the crystal glass onto the driveway. It shattered against the wet gravel, the sound sharp and violent.
Arthur?
Beatrice gasped, taking a step back, her hand flying to the pearl necklace at her throat. He didn't apologize. He didn't look at her. He turned and walked back through the towering doors of his mansion into the blinding light and the swelling music of his high society gala. The ballroom was filled with 300 of the wealthiest people in the country. Politicians, investors, and aristocrats, all of them bowing to his influence, all of them raising glasses to his success. But as Arthur walked through the crowd, accepting their hollow congratulations, he felt nothing but a cold, gnawing void. The room was loud, but all he could hear was the quiet, devastating click of Julian Croft's car door shutting. The Vanguard Tower pierced the city skyline like a spear of black glass and steel. On the top floor, Julian Croft's private penthouse view of the sprawling metropolis. The exact same city Arthur Pendleton believed he owned. Inside, the silence was expensive. There was no storm here, only the faint, high-altitude hum of the climate control and the soft glow of recessed lighting reflecting off polished obsidian floors. Eleanor emerged from the guest suite. The ruined pastel blue silk dress had been discarded, replaced by a thick, oversized charcoal cashmere sweater and loose linen trousers provided by Julian's discreet staff. The fabric swallowed her slender frame, making her look fragile. But the way she carried herself had fundamentally changed. The shivering had stopped. Her back was perfectly straight. Her chestnut hair, now dry, fell in heavy waves over her shoulders. She walked into the main living area. Julian was standing by the floor, to ceiling windows, pouring 2 glasses of sparkling water. He had removed his velvet tuxedo jacket and unbuttoned his collar, looking less like a ruthless billionaire and more like a man guarding a sanctuary. He handed her a glass. "My security team has ensured the building is locked down. Arthur's people cannot track you here." "Arthur won't try," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but steady. "His pride won't allow him to chase a woman he just threw away in front of high society. He will expect me to crawl back when I run out of options. He thinks I have nothing." She walked past the luxurious leather sofas and moved straight toward the massive walnut dining table in the center of the room. She set her glass down. In her right hand, she still held the vintage silver key. Julian watched her with quiet intensity. He walked over to a sleek black console, retrieved a high-end encrypted laptop, and placed it on the table in front of her. He didn't ask what she needed it for. He simply provided the weapon. "Secure connection, untraceable," Julian said, stepping back to give her space. Eleanor opened the laptop. The cool blue light of the screen illuminated her pale ivory face. She placed the silver key on the polished walnut wood beside the trackpad. Earth. It wasn't just a physical key to the drafty annex where she had spent her miserable marriage. The numbers etched microscopically into the base of the silver handle were the master encryption code to a network of offshore accounts and shell companies she had built from nothing. For 3 years, while Arthur treated her as an invisible ghost, Eleanor had learned how to haunt his ledgers. She let her fingers hover over the keyboard for a fraction of a second, before she began to type. The clack of the keys was rhythmic, precise, and entirely devoid of hesitation. Arthur Pendleton's aristocratic empire was old money, built on legacy and prestige. But legacy did not generate liquid cash. To maintain his lavish lifestyle, to buy Beatrice her $1 million pearl necklaces, and to fund his aggressive real estate expansions, Arthur had quietly taken on massive amounts of leveraged debt. He assumed his creditors were a scattered network of faceless investment banks who would never dare call in the loans of a duke. He was wrong. Eleanor had taken the meager trust fund her disgraced family had left her and started playing the markets from the shadows of the annex. She was brilliant at it, cold calculating and patient. When her initial investments multiplied, she created a shadow firm, Vance Capital, and then piece by piece, she had begun buying up Arthur's debt. Every time an investment bank wanted to offload the high-risk Pendleton bonds, Vance Capital was there to quietly absorb them. The screen blinked, loading a series of complex financial dashboards. Eleanor bypassed the visual summaries and opened the core legal documents. Julian stepped closer, his dark eyes scanning the screen. He was a man who understood numbers better than he understood people. It took him exactly 4 seconds to process the data illuminating the dark room. His breath hitched. It was a microscopic break in his composure. But Eleanor caught it. "You own his debt," Julian murmured, genuine coloring his usually guarded tone. "All of the mezzanine loans on the Pendleton Tower, the mortgages on the commercial ports, the estate itself. 51% of his total liabilities." Eleanor corrected softly, her hazel eyes locked on the screen. "Earth, and a trigger clause that allows the primary creditor to demand immediate payment in full if the Pendleton Group's liquid assets drop below specific threshold." Julian leaned his hands on the back of her chair. He wasn't looking at the screen anymore. He was looking at her. The woman high society had written off as a tragic, useless wife was currently holding the detonator to one of the oldest empires in the country. "He is entirely over-leveraged," Julian said, his voice lowering into a dangerous register. "Arthur thinks he is a king, but he is sitting on a throne of paper. Eleanor, if you execute this margin call, you won't just embarrass him, you will liquidate him." "That is the intention," she said, her voice as smooth and cold as glass. Julian stepped around the table, standing opposite her. "I have capital, unlimited resources. I can deploy my legal team by sunrise. We can freeze his accounts, lock him out of his own boardrooms, and strip him of his titles before he even finishes his anniversary hangover. Let me do this for you." It was a generous offer, an offer of absolute protection and instant vengeance. Most women in her position would have grabbed it like a lifeline. Eleanor took her hands off the keyboard. She picked up the silver key and held it between her fingers. She looked up at Julian, meeting his intense gaze with perfect, expensive stillness. "No," Eleanor said. Julian blinked, surprised. "Eleanor, his lawyers are ruthless if you step into the light." "Julian," she interrupted gently, but the absolute authority in her tone made him stop speaking immediately. "I appreciate your coat, I appreciate your car, and I appreciate your sanctuary. But Arthur Pendleton spent 3 years telling the world I was weak. If you strike him down for me, he will simply tell himself that he was defeated by a fellow billionaire. He will find a way to preserve his ego." She stood up. Despite the oversized cashmere sweater, she radiated an untouchable grace. "Needs to feel the ice crack beneath his own feet." Eleanor continued, her voice echoing softly in the quiet penthouse. "Needs to look across a boardroom and realize that the woman he threw into the rain is the one holding the deed to his life. This is my board, and I play my own pieces." Julian stared at her for a long, profound moment. The protective urge in his eyes slowly morphed into something much deeper, Absolute unadulterated respect. He didn't see a victim anymore. He saw a queen. He took a slow step back, yielding the floor to her. A slow, sharp smile spread across his face. Then I suggest we prepare, Julian said softly, because when you drop this on him, the explosion is going to be magnificent. The view from Arthur Pendleton's corner office was designed to make other men feel small, perched on the 70th floor of the Pendleton Group Tower. The floor to ceiling glass offered a commanding sweep of the city's financial district. The interior was a shrine to old money-powered dark mahogany, paneled walls, a massive slab of a marble desk, and an oppressive, expensive silence. But this morning, the silence was broken by the nervous, shallow breathing of his chief financial officer. "Explain it to me again," Arthur said. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. He sat back in his leather executive chair, slowly turning a solid gold fountain pen between his fingers. The CFO, a man 20 years Arthur's senior, swallowed hard. He adjusted his glasses, avoiding Arthur's cold, gray eyes. "It's the mezzanine loans, Your Grace," the CFO stammered, pulling a thick file from his briefcase. "The extension we requested for the waterfront development project. It was denied. In fact, 3 of our primary lenders have sold our debt portfolios over the last 72 hours. Arthur stopped turning the pen. His sharp aquiline nose flared slightly. "Sold them? To whom?" "Our credit is flawless. To a private equity firm. Vance Capital," the CFO replied, tapping a page filled with redacted corporate structuring. "They have been aggressively acquiring our leveraged debt for months, but they moved silently through proxy buyers. Now, they hold the majority of our liabilities, and they are invoking the liquidity clauses. If we don't secure an immediate influx of cash, they can force a margin call on the entire group." Arthur's jaw tightened. The harsh, angular bones of his face seemed to sharpen. Vance Capital. The name echoed in his mind, generic and forgettable. He did not, for a single second, connect it to Eleanor Vance, the quiet, discarded woman he had thrown into the rain. To Arthur, Eleanor was a ghost, a creature incapable of understanding high finance, let alone orchestrating a corporate siege. "Earth, they are trying to squeeze us for a premium payout," Arthur sneered, tossing the gold fountain pen onto the marble desk. The heavy metal landed with a sharp clack. "Liquidate the secondary holdings in Europe. Cover the gap. No faceless hedge fund is going to dictate terms to the Pendleton family." "Yes, Your Grace," the CFO said, hastily gathering his papers. "I will prepare the authorizations for the quarterly shareholder meeting this Friday." As the CFO scrambled out of the office, the heavy oak doors opened again. "Earth." The sharp, rhythmic clicking of stiletto heels announced Lady Beatrice. She walked in as if she already owned the building. She wore a tailored crimson dress that clung to her statuesque frame, and resting against her collarbone, a stark contrast to the modern corporate environment, was the triple strand pearl necklace, Eleanor's necklace. But despite her polished appearance, Beatrice's piercing ice blue eyes were frantic. "Arthur," she said, bypassing the guest chairs and walking straight around his desk to drape her arms over his shoulders. "We have a problem." Arthur exhaled a sharp breath of irritation. "I am handling a multi-million-dollar liquidity issue, Beatrice. Whatever social triviality is bothering you, it can wait." "It is not a triviality," Beatrice snapped, pulling away, her porcelain face flushed with anger. "Do you have any idea what they are saying at the country club? What the society papers are whispering? They are saying your mousy little wife left you for Julian Croft. They are calling him her knight in shining armor. And they are calling me a cheap placeholder." Arthur's gray eyes, terrifyingly cold. The mention of Croft's name was a match dropped into a powder keg. For the past 3 days, the image of Croft, wrapping his bespoke coat around Eleanor's shoulders had haunted Arthur's every waking moment. It was a blatant disrespect to his authority. "Eleanor is nothing," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a freezing whisper. "Frost picked her up purely to insult me. He will tire of her by the end of the week." "Then prove it," Beatrice demanded, planting her hands on his marble desk. She leaned in, her platinum blonde hair falling over her shoulder. "Show them that she meant nothing to you and that I mean everything. The Pendleton estate signed the deed over to my name." Arthur looked at her, his dark brows knitting together. The estate was the crown jewel of his family's legacy. "If I am the undisputed lady." The whisper stopped. Beatrice pushed, her tone softening into a manipulative purr. "Sign it, Arthur. Show the world and show Eleanor that there is no place for her to return to." Arthur looked down at the solid gold fountain pen. He thought of Julian Croft's arrogant smirk under the black umbrella. He needed to reassert his dominance. He needed a public display of absolute control. "Friday," Arthur said, his voice hard, "at the quarterly shareholder meeting. The entire board will be present. I will sign the deed over to you there. It will be recorded in the official corporate minutes, the ultimate proof that the Pendleton Empire answers only to me." Beatrice's face lit up with a triumphant, cruel smile. She leaned down and kissed his cheek. "You are brilliant, darling." Later that evening, the rain had finally cleared, leaving the city slick and glittering. Arthur walked into the Sovereign Club, the most exclusive gentleman's lounge in the financial district. The air smelled of aged scotch and expensive cigar smoke. He spotted Julian Croft immediately. Julian was sitting in a high, backed leather chair by the fireplace, wearing a perfectly tailored Navy Day suit. He was reading a financial newspaper, a crystal glass of amber liquid resting on the table beside him. He looked entirely relaxed. Arthur's blood boiled. He strode across the Persian rug, coming to a halt directly in front of Julian's table.
"Where is she, Croft?"
Arthur demanded. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't even look up from his newspaper right away. He calmly turned the page, the rustle of the paper echoing loudly in the quiet corner of the club. Finally, Julian raised his dark, observant eyes. A slow, mocking smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Good evening to you too, Pendleton," Julian said smoothly. He picked up his glass and took a sip. "If you are referring to the Duchess, she is currently enjoying a level of peace you were entirely incapable of providing." Arthur leaned over the table, planting his fists on the polished wood. "She is my wife. You will return her to the estate, or I will bury your tech firm in litigation until you are bankrupt." Julian let out a quiet, genuine laugh. It was the most insulting sound Arthur had ever heard. "Bury me?" Julian asked, setting his glass down. He folded his newspaper neatly and looked Arthur dead in the eye. The quiet, dangerous aura around him suddenly sharpened. "You can't even afford to bury yourself right now, Arthur. I hear your credit lines are bleeding out. It seems you have a shadow creditor closing in on your throat." Arthur stiffened. "How do you know about Vance Capital?" Julian stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at Arthur not as a rival, but as a dead man walking. "I know a great many things," Julian said softly. He stepped closer, dropping his voice so only Arthur could hear. "But my advice to you, Your Grace, stop worrying about the wife you threw away. Start worrying about the ghost in your ledgers. She is coming for you." Julian stepped around him and walked out of the club, leaving Arthur standing frozen by the fire. Arthur's hands clenched into tight fists. "She is coming for you," he scoffed, shaking off the sudden, icy dread creeping up his spine. Croft was just playing mind games. No one could touch the Duke of Westshire. Come Friday, he would sign the deed, secure the cash, and remind the entire city exactly who was king. Friday morning arrived with a blinding, merciless sun that erased all memory of the freezing rain from 3 nights ago. Inside the master suite of the Vanguard penthouse, Eleanor stood before a full-length mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger to the aristocracy, but she was finally entirely herself. The faded, pastel blue silk dress, the uniform of a forgotten wife meant to blend into the wallpaper, was gone. Today, she wore a sharp, impeccably tailored emerald green power suit. The color was rich, commanding, and dangerous. The cut of the blazer and the clean lines of the trousers offered no fragility. Her chestnut hair was no longer pinned back in the severe, matronly styles Arthur had preferred. It fell in heavy, polished waves over her shoulders. A pair of minimalist diamond studs caught the morning light. Her only jewelry, she required no pearls. She required no borrowed prestige. Eleanor picked up the vintage silver key from the marble vanity. The tarnished metal felt warm against her skin now. She slipped it securely into the pocket of her blazer, her fingers lingering on it for just a second. Physical anchor, a loaded gun. When she walked out into the main living area, Julian Croft was waiting. He wore a slate gray suit, looking every bit the ruthless tech billionaire the world knew him to be. But as Eleanor walked toward him, his dark, observant eyes softened with a profound, quiet respect. Vance Capital is fully mobilized, Julian said, his voice a low, steady hum in the quiet room. The legal filings are complete. The margin call is queued, and through a minor subsidiary, I have acquired a proxy seat at the Pendleton shareholder meeting. He offered a faint, razor-sharp smile just to enjoy the view. You don't have to be there, Eleanor said, her voice carrying an expensive stillness. I wouldn't miss it for the world, Julian replied, stepping aside to open the penthouse door for her.
After you.
10 miles away, the Pendleton Group Tower was a fortress of corporate anxiety. On the 70th floor, the executive boardroom was an intimidating expanse of dark mahogany walls, soundproof glass, and a massive black glass conference table that stretched 20 feet long. At the head of the table sat Arthur Pendleton, Duke of Westshire. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit with his family crest pinned to the lapel. He looked entirely unbothered by the fact that half of his board of directors were sweating through their expensive shirts. Sitting in a gallery chair positioned directly behind his right shoulder was Lady Beatrice. She wore a pristine white designer dress, her legs crossed elegantly. Resting prominently against her porcelain skin was the heavy, triple strand pearl necklace. She looked triumphant, a queen waiting for her coronation. Arthur tapped his solid gold fountain pen against the black glass. The sharp clack brought the murmuring board members to a dead halt. Let us dispense with the panic, said his deep baritone rolling across the room with absolute authority. His cold gray eyes swept over the dozen executives. I am aware that a shadow firm calling itself Vance Capital is attempting to leverage our mezzanine debt. It is a minor liquidity annoyance. By Monday, my legal team will have tied their margin call in endless injunctions. The Pendleton legacy does not bow to anonymous hedge funds. The chief financial officer looked like he wanted to argue, but the sheer, oppressive weight of Arthur's arrogance silenced him. Before we move to the quarterly projections, Arthur continued, smoothly shifting the narrative back to his absolute control. I am executing a transfer of deed to ensure the stability of the Pendleton estate's private holdings. The primary residence and its surrounding grounds will be transferred immediately into the name of Lady Beatrice. A subtle ripple of shock went through the older board members. Transferring the ancestral estate to a mistress was a gross violation of old money tradition. But Arthur's jaw was set. He was doing this to prove a point. Earth. He was doing this to erase the ghost of Julian Croft putting a coat around his discarded wife. He was doing this to prove that Eleanor meant nothing. Arthur uncapped the heavy gold fountain pen. He pulled the thick, ivory, parchment deed toward him. Beatrice leaned forward, her ice blue eyes gleaming with raw, unfiltered greed. Down in the towering glass and steel lobby of the building, the atmosphere had just violently shifted. The security guards, who normally would have asked the quiet, fading Duchess for her ID badge out of sheer disrespect, froze at their stations. The rhythmic, sharp click of stilettos against the marble floor echoed like a metronome ticking down to an explosion. Eleanor bypassed the reception desk without looking at them. The emerald green of her suit cut through the monotonous sea of black and gray business attire like a blade. Employees who had mocked her behind her back stopped mid-sentence, their mouths falling open. She did not shrink. She did not lower her eyes. She walked with a cold grace that demanded absolute silence. She stepped into the private executive elevator, Earth. Julian Croft stepped in silently behind her, keeping his distance, allowing her to claim the entire space. Back on the 70th floor, Arthur brought the gold nib of his pen down toward the signature line of the deed. Click. The heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom did not just open. They swung wide, pushed by the hands of the executive assistants who scrambled to get out of the way. Arthur stopped, the gold pen hovering an inch above the paper. He looked up, his brow furrowing in irritation at the interruption. The board members turned in their leather chairs. Beatrice let out a loud, indignant sigh. Then the room lost its breath. Eleanor stepped over the threshold. The silence that hit the boardroom was instantaneous and absolute. It wasn't the respectful quiet granted to the Duke. It was the breathless, paralyzed silence of a room realizing a predator had just walked in. Arthur's hand went completely still. His gray eyes widened, the irritation vanishing, replaced by a shock so profound it seemed to anchor him to his chair. He expected a broken woman. He expected a weeping, humiliated wife crawling back to beg for a meager allowance. He expected the faded pastel blue dress and the trembling shoulders he had discarded in the rain. Instead, he was looking at an untouchable monarch. The emerald green suit radiated power. Her chestnut hair framed a face of pale ivory perfection, completely devoid of the tired shadows that had haunted her for 3 years. Her wide, set hazel eyes, which used to look down at the floor when he scolded her, were now locked dead onto his, and they were as cold and deep as a frozen lake. She did not look at the board members. She did not look at the sweating CFO. She didn't even look at Beatrice, whose arrogant smile had instantly collapsed into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Eleanor walked slowly, deliberately, toward the black glass table. The click of her heels was the only sound in the 70-story tower. Julian Croft walked in quietly a few paces behind her, moving toward the spectator seating. He sat down, crossed his legs, and offered Arthur a faint, devastating smile. Arthur's aristocratic jaw parted slightly. The gold fountain pen in his hand felt suddenly very heavy and very, very useless. Eleanor. Arthur breathed, the name slipping out of him before his pride could stop it. She stopped at the opposite end of the long black table. She looked at the man who had forgotten her heart, the man who had thrown her out in the storm, and she did not feel a single ounce of pain. She only felt the cold, expensive metal of the silver key resting in her pocket. "Hello, Arthur," Eleanor said. Her voice was smooth, quiet, and carried the lethal weight of an executioner's axe. "Put the pen down. You no longer have the authority to sign that paper." The words hung in the climate, controlled air of the boardroom, freezing the blood of every executive sitting at the black glass table. "Put the pen down." Nobody spoke to Arthur Pendleton like that. Not his board, not his rivals, and certainly not the quiet, fading wife he had banished to the damp corners of his estate. For 3 seconds, Arthur could not process the command. He stared at Eleanor, trying to reconcile the memory of the trembling woman in the rain with the untouchable, emerald-clad monarch standing at the opposite end of his boardroom. His cold gray eyes flickered to Julian Croft, who was leaning comfortably back in a leather gallery chair, long legs crossed, watching the scene with the relaxed anticipation of a man sitting in the front row of a theater. The presence of his rival snapped Arthur out of his paralysis. His aristocratic jaw hardened, his pride violently rejecting the reality in front of him. Security. Arthur barked, his deep baritone echoing off the mahogany walls. He pointed the solid gold fountain pen at Eleanor. Though his knuckles were white, this is a closed executive session. Eleanor, whatever pathetic theatrical stunt Croft has funded for you, it ends now. You are embarrassing yourself. Eleanor did not flinch. She did not raise her voice to match his. She simply began to walk the length of the 20-foot table. Her stride was measured, unhurried, and completely devoid of fear. The board members instinctively leaned back in their chairs as she passed, as if afraid her sharp emerald suit might cut them. And Croft is not funding anything, Eleanor said smoothly, her voice a quiet, lethal current. He is merely holding a proxy seat to observe the proceedings. I am here entirely on my own behalf. Arthur called the guards. Beatrice suddenly shrieked. The mistress stood up from her gallery seat, her pristine white dress rustling sharply. Panic had shattered her polished veneer. She clutched the triple strand pearl necklace at her throat, her ice blue eyes darting between Arthur and the approaching Duchess. How dare she walk in here? Have her removed immediately! She is trespassing! Eleanor stopped walking. She was standing exactly halfway down the table. Slowly, she turned her head and looked at Beatrice. It was not a look of anger. It was the detached, clinical observation of a scientist examining an insect. You can keep the pearls, Beatrice, Eleanor said, the absolute stillness in her tone making the hair on the CFO's arms stand up. They are going to be the only thing of value you walk out of this building with. Now sit down. The adults are conducting business. Beatrice's mouth opened and closed, completely stripped of her voice. She sank back into her chair as if her legs had given out. Arthur's face darkened with fury. He slammed his hand flat against the black glass table.
Enough?
I do not know how you bypassed the lobby, Eleanor, but I am signing the deed to the estate right now. You have no authority here. You have nothing. I have the leverage, Arthur. Eleanor corrected softly. She reached the head of the table, standing just a few feet away from her husband. She reached into the pocket of her tailored blazer. She withdrew the vintage silver key, the heavy, tarnished piece of metal from the drafty annex, where he had locked her away to be forgotten. She dropped it onto the black glass table. Clack. The sound was sharp, heavy, and final. It rested right next to the ivory parchment deed that Arthur was trying to sign. Then Eleanor placed a thick, sealed financial dossier down beside it. It bore the heavy embossed seal of the SEC and the banking commission. You told your CFO that a shadow firm called Vance Capital was a minor liquidity annoyance. Eleanor said, her hazel eyes locking onto his cold gray ones. You assumed it was a faceless hedge fund trying to squeeze you for a premium. Arthur stared at the silver key. His breath hitched. Terrible, creeping sensation of dread began to crawl up the back of his neck. The name echoed in his mind again. Vance Capital. It is remarkable, Arthur. Eleanor continued, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the boardroom. How for 3 years you never once considered the maiden name of the woman you married. You thought legacy and old money made you untouchable. You forgot that mathematics does not care about your titles. Arthur's aristocratic face drained of color. The light olive skin turned a sickly shade of ash. His hand hovered over the dossier. He flipped open the heavy cover. There, printed in stark black ink on the primary ownership ledger of Vance Capital, was the sole managing director's name, Eleanor Vance. No. Arthur whispered. It was an involuntary sound. He looked up, his eyes wild, frantic. He looked past Eleanor, straight at Julian Croft. You bankrolled this. You set up the shell companies. You gave her the capital to bypass the banking regulations? Julian Croft let out a low, dark chuckle. He raised a hand in mock surrender. Don't look at me, Pendleton, Julian said smoothly, his dark eyes gleaming with profound respect for the woman standing at the table. I didn't spend a single dime. The Duchess built the guillotine entirely by herself. I am just here to watch the blade fall. Arthur's gaze snapped back to Eleanor. The reality was crashing down on him, crushing the breath from his lungs. The quiet, invisible wife he had ignored. The woman he had thrown into the freezing rain with nothing but a leather suitcase. She hadn't been crying in the annex. She had been hunting. 51%. Eleanor said, delivering the numbers with the cold precision of a surgeon. Earth. I own 51% of the Pendleton Group's leveraged liabilities. I own the mezzanine debt on this tower. I own the commercial port mortgages. And most importantly, I hold the primary lien on the ancestral estate. Arthur looked down at the solid gold fountain pen in his trembling hand. He looked at the deed, waiting for his signature. You cannot sign that deed to Beatrice, Eleanor stated, her voice lowering into a devastating whisper, because the estate is collateral. And as of 900 a.m. this morning, I have frozen the assets. The pen in your hand, Arthur, is completely and utterly useless. Impossible. The word tumbled from Arthur's lips, hollow and devoid of its usual booming authority. His hand, still gripping the solid gold fountain pen, shook with a microscopic tremor. He stared at the thick financial dossier resting on the black glass table, treating it as if it were an unexploded bomb. You are a disgraced daughter from a bankrupt family, Arthur said, his voice rising, trying desperately to find the familiar ground of his arrogance. You had nothing when I married you. You have nothing now. This paperwork is forged. Eleanor did not blink. She did not defend herself against his insults. She simply gestured gracefully toward the chief financial officer, who was sitting 3 chairs down, sweating through his expensive, tailored shirt. Sterling, Eleanor said smoothly. You have served the Pendleton family for 2 decades. I invite you to examine the SEC filings. Please tell your Duke if I am hallucinating. The CFO swallowed hard. His hands trembled as he reached across the table and pulled the heavy dossier toward him. The room watched in agonizing silence as he flipped through the pages. The only sound was the crisp rustle of high-grade paper and the shallow, frantic breathing of Lady Beatrice in the background. As Sterling read the documents, all the remaining color drained from his face. He took off his glasses, wiping his forehead with a shaking hand. Your Grace, the CFO whispered, his voice cracking in the dead, silent room. He didn't look at Arthur. He looked down at the table. The seals are authentic. The routing numbers match the acquisitions we've been tracking all week. Vance Capital is the primary holder of our mezzanine debt, the liquidity trigger. It is fully active. She owns the paper. Arthur felt the floor drop out from beneath him. The executives around the table, men who had spent years nodding at his every command, suddenly shifted their postures. They were no longer looking at him with reverence. They were looking at him like he was a captain standing on a sinking ship, holding a broken compass. How? Arthur choked out. The anger was fading, replaced by a suffocating, terrifying confusion. How did you do this from the annex? You had no capital. You had no connections. Eleanor's hazel eyes were perfectly calm. The emerald green of her power suit caught the harsh overhead lights, making her look like she was carved from precious stone. I had 3 years of absolute silence, Arthur, Eleanor said, her voice carrying expensive, devastating stillness. When you married me to settle my father's debts, you assumed I was the one who failed. You assumed my family's bankruptcy was a reflection of my intellect. You were wrong. My father was a fool with money. I am not. She took a slow, deliberate step along the edge of the table. You placed me in the West Wing Annex. She continued, her tone conversational, but sharp enough to draw blood. You told the staff to ignore me. You cut my social allowance. You left me with nothing but a basic internet connection and a small, restricted trust fund. But you forgot one crucial thing about leaving a woman in the dark. Arthur stared at her, paralyzed. Her eyes adjust. Eleanor said softly, while you were drinking $1,000 champagne in the ballroom, I was reading your quarterly earnings reports. While you were taking Beatrice to Paris, I was shorting the over-leveraged tech stocks your friends recommended. I multiplied my trust. I built proxy accounts. And then I started buying the exact debt your CFO thought was safely hidden in bundled derivatives. She paused, letting the reality of her words crush whatever was left of his ego. You built an empire on legacy? Eleanor whispered. I bought it with your own neglect. Arthur, do something. Beatrice's shrill voice shattered the quiet of the boardroom. The mistress was standing again, her hands gripping the back of her leather chair, so how hard her knuckles were white. Her pristine white dress suddenly looked foolish, out of place in a room where real empires were being dismantled.
She is lying?
Beatrice demanded, pointing a trembling finger at Eleanor. Her ice blue eyes were wide with panic.
She is a nobody. Send the deed, Arthur!
Send the house over to me and call the police to have her arrested for
Fraud.
Arthur did not move. He couldn't. The gold pen slipped from his fingers, clattering uselessly against the black glass. The sound echoed like a final gavel strike. He realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that he had absolutely no power left. Eleanor turned her head slowly to look at Beatrice. The mistress shrank back instantly, recognizing that the dynamic had violently shifted. There was no Arthur to protect her anymore. There was only Eleanor, radiating cold, untouchable grace. I told you. Beatrice, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a register that made the entire board hold their breath. You can keep the pearls. Eleanor let her eyes travel down to the heavy triple-strand pearl necklace resting against Beatrice's chest, the heirloom that had been a symbol of ultimate status 20 minutes ago, now looked like a cheap costume prop. You wore them to humiliate me? Eleanor continued, stepping closer to the gallery seating. You wore them to prove that you had replaced me in this family, but you don't seem to understand how finance works. Those pearls belong to the Pendleton estate, and as of this morning, the Pendleton estate belongs to Vance Capital. Beatrice's hands flew to her neck, covering the pearls as if Eleanor were going to rip them off her throat. Keep them? Eleanor said, a faint, razor-sharp smile touching her lips. Wear them to your next country club luncheon, because pretending to be royalty is the only thing you will have left when the bank forecloses on the castle. Beatrice let out a small, pathetic sob. Her legs gave out completely, and she collapsed back into her chair, her face buried in her hands. The polished, cruel IT girl of the high society elite had been dismantled without Eleanor ever raising her voice. The room lost its voice completely. A dozen powerful men sat frozen in their expensive suits, staring in abject terror at the woman standing at the head of the table. They had laughed at her behind her back. They had ignored her at galas. And now their careers, their bonuses, and their corporate survival rested entirely in her manicured hands. In the back row, Julian Croft leaned forward, resting his chin on his hands. His dark eyes shone with absolute, unadulterated respect. He had known she was brilliant, but witnessing her execute the kill was a masterpiece. Eleanor turned back to Arthur. The Duke of Westshire looked broken. His broad shoulders were slumped, his aristocratic features slack with the realization that his arrogance had cost him everything. He looked up at her, his cold gray eyes finally filling with something he had never felt in his entire life, fear. Eleanor reached across the table. With one smooth motion, she pushed the useless gold fountain pen out of the way. She slid the heavy financial dossier directly in front of him. The margin call is active, Arthur, Eleanor said softly. You have exactly 4 hours to produce liquid cash you do not have, or you surrender the keys. Leave us. The command was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the heavy, suffocating air of the boardroom. Arthur Pendleton did not look up from the financial dossier. He kept his eyes locked on the paper that spelled his absolute ruin, his broad shoulders hunched, as if bearing the physical weight of a collapsing skyscraper. For a moment, no one moved. The executives were too paralyzed by the shock of the corporate slaughter they had just witnessed.
I said, leave.
Arthur roared, his voice cracking with a raw, desperate agony that none of these men had ever heard from the Duke of Westshire. The spell broke. The board members scrambled out of their leather chairs, practically trampling over one another in their haste to escape the blast radius. They shoved past the heavy mahogany doors, their expensive briefcases clutched to their chests. Beatrice was the last of them to move. She stumbled upright, her face streaked with ruined makeup, clutching her pearl necklace as she fled the room without a single backward glance at the man she had sworn to love. Only Julian Croft remained seated. He slowly stood up, smoothing the lapels of his slate gray suit. He looked at Arthur's broken figure, then turned his dark, observant eyes to Eleanor. He didn't ask if she needed him to stay. He simply waited for her directive. Eleanor met his gaze and gave him a fraction of a nod, a silent reassurance. Sir, I have this. Julian offered a faint, respectful smile. He walked gracefully out of the boardroom, pulling the massive doors shut behind him. But he did not leave the floor. He stood in the corridor, clearly visible through the soundproof glass wall. A dark, protective silhouette waiting patiently for the woman he revered. A constant visual reminder to Arthur of exactly what he had lost. The silence inside the boardroom rushed back in, heavier than before. Arthur slowly raised his head. The cold, aristocratic arrogance that had defined his entire existence was completely gone. His light olive skin was a sickly gray, and his deep, set eyes were wide with a frantic, unspooling terror. Earth. The charcoal suit that had looked so commanding 20 minutes ago suddenly seemed 2 sizes too big, hanging off a man who had just been hollowed out. Eleanor, Arthur whispered. He said her name like a drowning man grasping for a lifeline. He pushed his chair back and stood up. His legs were unsteady. He took a hesitant step around the black glass table, moving toward her. Eleanor did not step back. Earth. She stood perfectly still in her sharp emerald suit, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. She looked at him with the detached composure of a judge watching a guilty man approach the bench. You have made your point, Arthur pleaded, his voice trembling as the distance between them closed. You are brilliant, a tactical genius. I was blind, Eleanor. I was an absolute, arrogant fool.
I see that now.
I see you. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her arm. He wanted to touch her, to bridge the massive canyon he had spent 3 years digging between them. But the sheer, freezing stillness radiating from her stopped his hand in mid-air. He let it drop uselessly to his side. We are still husband and wife, Arthur said, the desperation leaking into his tone, stripping him of all his dignity. You are still the Duchess of Westshire. This is our family legacy. You don't have to tear it down. We can run this empire together. I will banish Beatrice today. She will never set foot in the city again. You will have everything. Eleanor looked at his pleading face. She remembered standing in the annex, listening to the muffled sounds of his extravagant parties. She remembered the cold rain soaking through her silk dress while he drank red wine on the portico. I already have everything, Arthur, Eleanor said softly. Her voice lacked malice, which somehow made it infinitely more devastating. And I already run this empire. I don't need your permission to occupy a throne I bought myself. Arthur's knees seemed to weaken. He grabbed the edge of the black glass table to keep himself upright. Please, Arthur begged. The word tore out of his throat, harsh and unfamiliar. The Duke of Westshire, a man who had crushed rivals, without a second thought, was openly pleading, "Eleanor, please, don't take the estate. It has been in my family for 400 years. It is my home." "It was never a home," she corrected him, her hazel eyes completely void of sympathy. "It was a museum for your ego, and it was a prison for me."
I am sorry.
Arthur cried out, his composure finally shattering. Tears, real, hot tears of absolute despair, welled in his cold gray eyes. "I am so sorry for how I treated you. I am sorry for the rain. I am sorry for the silence. I was wrong." The apology echoed off the dark mahogany walls. It was the apology she had quietly prayed for during her first year of marriage. It was the validation she had wept for when she still believed her husband had a heart, but hearing it now, standing in her power, it felt like dust. "An apology," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a quiet, elegant chill, "is just a receipt for a debt you cannot pay. Your regret does not move me, Arthur. It only bores me." Arthur stared at her, the tears spilling over his harsh cheekbones. He realized with absolute finality that there was no love left to manipulate. There was no fragile wife hiding beneath the emerald suit. He had starved her of affection for so long that she had learned to survive entirely on ice. "You didn't forget I was your wife, Arthur," Eleanor said, delivering the final fatal blow to his conscience. "You just didn't care. Not until I held the knife to your throat. You are not sorry for breaking me. You are only sorry that you lost." Arthur collapsed into the nearest leather chair. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, pathetic sobs. The king had fallen, and his crown was nothing but paper. Eleanor looked down at him for a long, quiet moment. She felt no triumph. She felt no cruelty. She only felt the profound, expensive piece of a scale finally balanced. "The financial transfer documents will be delivered to your lawyers within the hour," Eleanor said smoothly, turning away from his broken figure. "I suggest you sign them. A quiet surrender will save you the indignity of a public bankruptcy." She did not wait for his answer. She did not need it. The scratch of the gold nib against the thick parchment sounded like a dying breath. Arthur Pendleton's hand trembled so violently that his signature, usually a bold, sweeping stroke of aristocratic pride, looked jagged and weak. It was the signature of a broken man. With a final agonizing drag of the pen, he relinquished his ancestral estate, his majority holding, and his unchecked power. The Duke of Westshire had been erased by his own hand. Arthur let the solid gold fountain pen drop onto the black glass table. It rolled an inch and stopped, a useless piece of metal. He stared at the paperwork through red, swollen eyes. The massive boardroom, once his kingdom, felt like a tomb. There was no one left to give him orders, no one left to fear him, and absolutely no one left to save him. 70 floors below, the reality of the empire's collapse was already bleeding into the polished marble lobby. Lady Beatrice stood near the revolving glass doors, frantically tapping the screen of her designer phone. Her flawless porcelain face was tight with panic. The private car service she had used for the past 2 years was declining her requests. The corporate accounts associated with her name had been frozen within minutes of Eleanor's margin call. Beatrice snapped, grabbing the arm of a passing socialite, a woman who just yesterday had kissed her cheek at a charity luncheon. "Margaret,
Let me use your driver.
my accounts are having a ridiculous technical issue." The socialite stopped. She looked at Beatrice's grip on her arm, then slowly raised her eyes to the heavy, triple strand pearl necklace resting against Beatrice's chest. The news of the boardroom slaughter had already rippled through the building's elite channels. Everyone knew. "Let go of my arm, Beatrice," the socialite said, her voice dropping to a temperature of absolute zero. She pulled her arm away, brushing her sleeve as if she had been touched by something unclean. "And I suggest you take off the Duchess's pearls before the new owner's security team arrests you for theft. Good day. Margaret walked away, stepping smoothly into a waiting luxury sedan. Beatrice was left standing alone in the massive lobby. The security guards, the executives, the receptionists, they all looked right through her. Without Arthur's money and protection, the polished, cruel IT girl was entirely invisible. She shrank back into the shadows of a marble pillar, gripping the pearls like a heavy, suffocating chain. Up on the 70th floor, Eleanor walked out of the boardroom. She did not look back at Arthur. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind her, sealing him in his prison of regret. Julian Croft was waiting for her in the corridor, standing just outside the soundproof glass wall. He pushed off the wall and fell into step beside her. He did not ask what had happened. He did not ask if Arthur had cried. Julian simply looked at her sharp emerald power suit, her steady posture, and the calm, untouchable grace in her hazel eyes, and he knew the transfer is complete. Julian asked quietly as he pressed the elevator call button. "It is," Eleanor replied, her voice smooth and even. "The Pendleton Group will be restructured under Vance Capital. The debt is secured." The polished steel doors of the private elevator slid open. They stepped inside, and the car began its rapid descent, and the estate. Julian asked, his dark, observant eyes watching her reflection in the mirrored doors. "Will you move back in? Claim the master suit." Eleanor reached into the pocket of her blazer. Her slender fingers traced the cold, jagged edges of the vintage silver key. It was the key to the drafty annex, the anchor that had kept her focused during 3 years of neglect, the weapon she had just used to conquer a dynasty. She pulled the key out and looked at it resting in the palm of her hand. "No," Eleanor said softly. Julian tilted his head, intrigued.
No. Arthur begged me not to take it.
He said. It was his home, his history. Eleanor murmured, staring at the tarnished metal, "But it was never my home. It is a museum built on arrogance and coldness.
Yeah.
If I move back in, I am simply becoming the new warden of an old cage." The elevator chimed, arriving at the lobby level. "I am going to sell it," Eleanor said, a profound, expensive peace settling over her features. "I will liquidate the property, donate the grounds to the city for a public botanical garden, and erase the Pendleton name from the gates. I do not need his castle to prove I am a queen." Julian let out a quiet breath. The respect in his eyes deepened into something bordering on reverence. He had offered to destroy Arthur for her, but Eleanor had done something far more permanent. She had outgrown him entirely. The elevator doors opened. The lobby, which had been buzzing with frantic whispers, went completely dead. Every eye turned toward the elevator bank. They saw Julian Croft, the billionaire titan, standing respectfully, half a step behind the woman they had all dismissed. Eleanor walked across the marble floor. The sharp click of her heels echoed like a metronome, counting down the end of an era. She did not look at the executives bowing their heads. She did not look at Beatrice, who was hiding behind a pillar, weeping silently. Eleanor simply walked toward the glass doors, her spine perfectly straight, her emerald suit catching the brilliant sunlight spilling into the building. Outside, the freezing rain from 3 nights ago was a distant memory. The city was bright, warm, and waiting. Julian's sleek black town car was idling at the curb. The uniformed driver scrambled to open the rear door, but Julian waved him off. Julian opened the door himself, holding it wide for the new owner of the Pendleton Empire. He didn't offer her his coat this time. She didn't need it. She wasn't shivering anymore. "After you, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice rich with quiet admiration. Eleanor paused. She dropped the vintage silver key into a nearby valet's tip jar, discarding the final piece of Arthur Pendleton's memory. Without a second thought, she turned to Julian, offering him a faint, breathtaking smile. "Thank you, Julian," she said. She stepped into the leather-scented interior of the car. Julian closed the door with a solid, expensive thud. High above them, trapped behind the dark glass of the 70th floor, Arthur Pendleton stood at the window watching the town car pull smoothly away from the curb and disappear into the bustling city. The crushing weight of his empty boardroom pressed down on him, and the absolute silence of the room echoed with the realization of a truth he could never outrun. He had forgotten her heart for years, and now she had taken the world.